tar bare opp det som er mål. Altså. Begge de da.
Yeah, welcome back to this afternoon session of cross-adaptive processing. It feels like a well-behaved party so far. I'm enjoying myself immensely. And I'm looking forward to Marije Baalman talk about instrumental affordances, crossadaptivity as instrumental gesture.
Hello. I'm very happy to be here. So my role in the whole project is kind of be an external advisor, so sort of observing from even a greater distance. So actually, as I was preparing the talk, I focused a bit more on the concept of instrumentality, to try and figure out what is actually going on. So first I was thinking like, okay, and Øyvind already mentioned a little bit in the introduction this morning, sort of the different performance practices that are related to cross-adaptive processing, where we can draw parallels and also see where it's different from these performance practices. And then I will go on to talk about different notions of instrumentality. Briefly discuss the issues of agency that came up over all the past sessions, what I got from reading the blog and the discussions that we've had. And then I'll talk about a concept of shared instrumentality, and then about the different instrumental skills that come into play. So yeah, in terms of performance practices, one that it's related to, of course, is musicians whose main instrument is actually processing the audio from another musician. There's, for example, Naftali, who's been doing this for 20, 30 years or something. Joel Ryan has been doing this also for, I think, 50 years by now. Very long. So basically what happens there usually is that they have a setup that they've built over time with a range of possibilities of how they can process different sounds. So they can choose which ones they want to use, when, and they have ways of controlling parameters of this processing while they are playing. And then during the performance, what they're doing is if they're very attentively listening to what the other musician is playing and take their decisions based on what they are hearing. And in that way there's kind of a dialogue between the musician playing an instrument. For example, Joe Ryan has played a lot with Evan Parker, so he's listening to that, and then Joel plays his processed sound. So and then there's a dialogue unfolds between the two. Then Naftali has written a lot in a recent article in a book about her process, because her problem starting to do this in the 90s was like, well, how do I make clear to my fellow musicians what I'm actually doing? How do I make it clear to the sound engineer? And how do I make it clear to the audience what I'm actually doing there on stage? So she wrote a lot about how can I make my invisible instrument visible, and and that's both sort of like making it sonically distinct, but also how can people see what I do with my body, what is happening. So this is one practice that's relevant. The other one, which also came up, is the augmented instruments. There are a lot of like musicians who, at some point, they want a bit more with their acoustic instrument, so they start adding like audio processing effects, sometimes also sensors to control this processing then. So basically what happens there, the acoustic sound of the instrument is captured with a microphone so that it can be processed. Sensors or controllers are used to switch between these effects or give additional control. Sometimes they're also using kind of the ancillary movements which are picked up by sensors that are used to guide the processing. So instead of having like a set of pedals next to the playing or a set of sliders, actually they're using the movement of the instrument itself. For example, the movement of the flute is used to change the processing. And in some cases this kind of setup also includes adaptive processing, so analyzing the signal that is played, and based on that having a system that adds processing. For example, Hans Leeuw has been doing that with his electrumpet. One thing which is notable, that quite often the design of this instrument and the performance is done by the same person. So the musician has a very close relationship to actually building this. Sometimes there's someone who helps sort of setting up the sensors and stuff, but sort of doing like the mappings and choosing the effects that are controlled and how they are controlled is decided by the musician. And then another practice that I think cross-adaptive processing is closely related to is the interactive music machines, or live algorithms as they have been coined, which is also listening to a musician. And most of the time it's sort of like to create sort of a computer agent that can improvise with a musician. So the system is set up that it listens to what kind of music the musician is playing. So it's doing like pitch analysis, also analysis of phrases, tempo analysis, and based on that it makes decisions on what to play back to the musician. So it's not so much doing, well, in some cases it's also doing effects, but it's doing a lot of more semantic analysis and replying in that sense. And sort of in this live algorithm paradigm, ideally there's no human operator, so the only thing that happens is the algorithm is started and the computer is not touched, which I think is also the case in the cross-adaptive processing up to now. So yeah, I think I said everything that's on these slides in other words. So. And then another, probably quite obvious, is sort of group improvisation, where a group of musicians is just playing together, and together, like their sound together, creates a sonic texture. So sometimes, like during playing, it feels like it's just one flow together, where it feels like it's more than the sum of the parts. And then in this context of group improvisation, there's also notions of complexity which come into that. So, yeah, as I said, cross-adaptive processing has elements of each of these practices. Like one musician is processing sound of another musician. It's augmenting the sound of an instrument through processing. There's kind of fixed algorithms and mappings that creates like these connections between the analysis and the processing, and there's improvisation happening. But then there's also contrasts, like the processing is not guided by a human operator in real time. I mean, beforehand it is, but while the performance is happening, it's not. The control over the processing is based on the musical qualities of the acoustic instrument. So that's a kind of less direct way of controlling. Most of the mappings are direct, so it's one person is playing something and that immediately affects what is happening to the other sound, except for the live convolver, which has a kind of time shift there. And then another interesting thing that happens is because the instruments get connected, you kind of get to where it's more like a group of people playing together one instrument that consists of the acoustic instruments and the cross-adaptive connections. So this was just to get kind of a picture of, okay, where in what field is kind of cross-adaptive processing moving, which then sort of brings it to instrumentality. What is the instrumentality of cross-adaptive processing? So these are some quotes and concepts that I took out of the blog. And yeah, so it's like giving way some part of what you've played and must be capable of being transformed out of your control. In this discussion of the live convolver, there was a lot of actually different viewpoints as well, like who has control, and that was sort of the control over the timing versus the control over the sonic material. And some people, they feel more in control when they have control over the timing. Other people feel more in control if they're controlling the sonic quality. The control intimacy, like how close is the physical gesture to the sound, reactive inertia, which also came up before the break. So how fast can you change the sound that you're playing to react to what's happening? Then this idea felt like there was a third musician present, so that's sort of the invisible instrument. And that's kind of points like, is there like an agency of the cross-adaptive processes? Is that another agent that's going on there? So to bring this back to kind of more theoretical concept of instrumentality, there's an article by Peters who refers back to another article and then extends the concept there. So Alperson, he sort of has this idea that instrumentality is not the sheer mechanic activity of producing a sound, but a personally and socially intentional activity that turns the instrument into a musical one. So that also moves away this concept of the instrument being a physical object or just a physical object. So this activity includes the body in a way that in some cases it's difficult to know where the body ends and where the instrument begins, so that the performance musical instrument is better understood as an amalgam of material object, the performer's body, the bodily dispositions as habituated by the developments of various musically related skills. So it's sort of, makes this concept of instrumentality much more embedded, sort of, or a cultural one that's not just the object but also related to the musician and the musical context. And then it's also related to the actual work. So the performativity, performer and performed instruments is intertwined with the work. So the instrumentality is something that happens in the performance, and you can't really see it separate from that. As a side issue, there's another book, so this is just a reading suggestion. There's a book that quite recently came out from Marcel Kobussen, who looks at musical improvisation as a complex system. And he also describes during an improvisation more actors are at work than musicians alone. It's the space, acoustics, instruments, audience, technicians, musical and social, cultural backgrounds, technology, and they all play like a significant role. But not all of these actants determine every improvisation to the same extent. Some are more prominent and active than others in certain situations. And yeah, the field of musical improvisation theory emphasizes singularity. So each improvisation yields a different network of actants and interactions, a unique configuration or assembly. So to go back to Peter's, and this was kind of a detour, now we're back. So he extends sort of this concept of Alperson with a kind of shared instrumentality. This concept that instrumentality is distributed, so many instruments join up to form a single instrument. For example, an orchestra, you can see it as a single instrument. But also that instrumentality can shift over time, like during a performance, from individual to distributed forms. So what's happening during a performance is consciously negotiating these individual territories, and then there's this interdependence of decision making, which then creates shared gestures. And then there can also be like this environmental agency that can enter and contribute its instrumentality. And then, yeah, what happens in viewing this is not only sort of the technical skill of each of the performers, but also the interpersonal skills and accomplishment that's going on there. So I think this is quite interesting to look at cross-adaptive processing from this view, because these interdependencies of decision-making are quite clearly, I think, constructed through this cross-adaptive processing setup. So any sort of musical sound that you create is always interdependent to the sound that's happening from someone else. And you can also see this cross-adaptive process set up as an environmental agency. And then the musician is continuously, that's sort of the conflict that Miller was talking about, of balancing the own individual sonic territory with the shared sonic territory. Well, at the same time, the other musicians are doing the same. So it's at any time the individual gesture is a shared gesture. So now we're slowly getting back to sort of more practical stuff. Yeah, the musicians that have been involved, they've been sort of struggling to transfer their existing skills to this new setup, because as you add like these effects and these side effects, yeah, the embodied link between like physical gesture and listening and the sound is broken or is extended. So your automatic reflexes don't work anymore. So your physical gestures, like your fingering, everything you do with your body, I mean, that knowledge is still there, and you can leverage that, but the listening and the reflexes you have to relearn based on listening. This, of course, takes time, was already mentioned before, and it also, since every setup is different depending on the musicians you're playing with and the setup, the technical setup. You also need to play with that musician to train this. So then to go one step further, since in practice you maybe can't always play with the same people, and you might also want to shift between different groups of people to play in these kinds of contexts. So then maybe this question comes up like, well, what are then the skills that a musician should have? And these could be kind of meta-instrumental skills. to play in ensembles using cross-adaptive processes. So I think one part of that is what the Oslo group has been doing is sort of, really analyzing, like, okay, what kind of analysis processes work well on my particular instrument and my particular way of playing, and then also what kind of processing works well for the kind of music that I play. Then also the experience in setting up mappings between, like, from the analysis to processing, and negotiating these with other musicians. I guess that's an important skill. And then the experience of playing in these different constellations, so being able to adapt to like these new environments with different musicians and different instruments. And this seems somehow related to this concept of second order virtuosity. It's coined by Marcus Lopez Hölzel and De Campo, which is more sort of the virtuosity is not like playing the instrument, but sort of adapting to different contexts in which to play the instrument. There's a bit of this which can be leveraged by the technical development in terms of the toolbox, because you can, like, there are of course similar, like, even if you have two flute players, there are certain methods which will work well for both flutes, both musicians, so you can sort of share this knowledge. Oh, this works well for the flute, and similarly for guitars and voice. So you can sort of make share this knowledge which methods work well for particular instruments, and then each musician can sort of select, well, these work really well for my style of playing. Similarly with the processing methods. Also this, I guess by just discussing different mapping strategies, which of course has been happening, like the blog is documenting like different ways of mapping of the different things that have been tried out. And then what's important is the close collaboration with the musicians to find these, because you can't really see like the acoustic instrument separate from the musician playing it. And then of course on the playing side, you have to do it just often with a stable configuration, probably at the start, just to get a feel for it, and then also in changing configurations to develop these meta-instrumental skills. Then I had sort of other questions which came up today, so I thought I just add a slide. Also this concept, like, is a particular cross-adaptive setup then a composition? I mean, that's kind of similar, like Voyager from George Lewis, which is it's kind of a interactive music machine, but I mean, every musician that plays with it gets a totally different output, but it is kind of seen as a composition in itself. So maybe that is something already in itself, or maybe it can transcend that. That's and then one other thing is like, which I think was with the live convolver, like if you leave out sort of like this link, so the signal of A is convolved with B, then it's not yet cross-adaptive, then you only have one line, so it's not a cross. So you need this other cross happening to have the cross-adaptive. I couldn't come up with a name for this yet. It's not auto-adaptive, it's ultra-adaptive maybe. So that's sort of what I have the references here. I can also just mail the slides around so people have those. So I think I think now we can just go to questions or discussion. I don't have the answers really. So Victor, I think there's a microphone coming. And I think we have plenty of time because Øyvind hasn't been waving at me, so. Or maybe I distracted him.
Thanks, Marije. Is it working? Okay. Thanks, Marije. It was a very interesting presentation and doing a bit of a taxonomy of the different ways that we can interact with, different ways we can interact. Now, with regards to the convolution there, I think there are two things. If you go back there, so the final slide.
Oh, the final, yeah.
Okay, so there are two ways that you can see this. One, if the convolution is happening in a way that they just played there before, in which you will record a impulse response and then you work on it, then I guess your figure there is correct in saying that one has a kind of a predominance over the other. But then there's another way you can, and we're going to see this later on, is that the two signals are coming in, and there's no recording. It's just they're going together, and you're sort of convolving one with the other. In which case, they have both of them have the same status, and they are truly crossing them. So in that case, then you only need one process to be crossing. And then you get a cross-adaptive processing with just one, because both of them are kind of crossed, and you don't know, there's no distinction between one being the filter and the other one being the input signal. But of course, that's a different, there are two, I guess, in the live convolution idea, there is the one where you're going to be recording, and then you use that for a little while, record again, and so on. And there's the one where you stream the two signals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was actually also the same sort of thing, like in some of the early experiments. I think there were also cases where you experimented with just doing analysis on one instrument and the effect on the other instrument, which is of course good to as a first exploration, but it's not yet cross-adaptive. It's just this ultra-adaptive.
I find it interesting to look at this and to discuss the terms, but as far as I can see, we can actually call it cross-adaptive when one influences the other, because there's something from one signal crossing over to the other one. So maybe we are also confusing in the figure here, making a cross. So there's no cross, there's one thing lining over to the other, but it's actually there's a crossing over of features from one signal to another. I don't know if we should call it two different things, but makes sense.
Thanks, Marije. It's really nice to get an overview or a framework of how to talk about these things. And I don't think it's. I think my question was sort of addressed by Øyvind again, but perhaps whether or not the technology is cross-adaptive or not, we might be confusing, or maybe there are at least two levels here. The signal flow is one thing, and the musical context that we are engaging in is another. And even if those, perhaps those two are not completely the same, meaning that we have to try and think about the musical situation that that happens not as separate from, but as a distinct thing from the actual processing scenario that is generated. So if it's an X or a Y on a signal level, is perhaps not as important as thinking about what are the implications for the musical actions that are taking place there.
just a quick comment. I will talk about the cross-adaptive audio effects framework tomorrow. In the original paper, I think they referred to what you showed as external adaptive. But several different definitions have been used. There isn't 100% agreement. And so, yeah, the really important thing is how you use it. What does it mean for performance?
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, I agree. Thank you for giving us a framework for talking about this. And I think your description of the mix as a performer between being, what did you call it, a mono. Could you find the slide?
Yeah, monadic.
Yeah, monadic, and yeah, this is something I really can recognize in this situation, you know, and it's difficult to kind of grasp because it has to do with your attention, the shift of attention. But this is as a very nice way of talking about it, I think, which illustrates good what situation you're in. And I agree that it's very also much about, because in free improvisation, which all of this is, this is also recognizable without the shared instrumentality. In a way, you can recognize the same way of being one voice or being a togetherness without the cross-adaptive procession, but it's really enhanced by the work we do here.
I found that your these concepts of the shared instrumentality interesting in this context, and I wonder if it's as we discussed in the mapping strategies, making things that go in the same direction. So more is more, like Trond said, or something that is in opposition to the gesture. Can you think of acoustics, because this shared instrumentality in an acoustic setting with an instrument group, do we have similar distinctions of shared instrumentality, like sameness or opposition?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I guess that's a matter of sort of going back to sort of looking at these mapping strategies and then see like, well, in what ways do these particular mappings support like shared instrumentality, and where do they maybe shift more back to the individual instrumentality. So I think that's something to reflect back upon, like, okay, how does this affect, how do these strategies affect these concepts? I don't have a like direct answer.
Right. Just one more comment on it. Would you include in the instrumentality concept, would it, let's say in a musical setting where there are parallel trajectories of things happening, so in an improvised setting you might just go on doing your own thing with as an independent thing, is that sort of a parallel instrumentality? Or is it not, does it not come into instrumentality?
Yeah, well, I guess you can have these, if you have like 5 people playing and then 2 might be playing with together in 2 groups, and then the third one might be doing something individual. So I guess then there's sort of 2 shared and 1 individual, which, I guess then there's more access of instrumentalities happening at the same time. I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I just it's maybe obvious, but when we talk about like even how can we examine the mappings regarding to what does more is more give compared to more is less, and I think is it really possible to just examine the mappings without examining at the same time a row of strategies to use them? You understand what I mean? Because I think a mapping can do very many things and doesn't. And it can, of course, be. Yeah, maybe we're looking for something that feels intuitive as a start. But when you start working with the things that are not so intuitive, you could come up with strategies that still give very musical meaning. So maybe there are different, levels of examining the mappings, or yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. But I think we are when we conceptualize these things and try to find a terminology, we also simplify the situation. So making a typical situation. So what you describe is more the complex applied situation where there's these things and several of them in addition to other things.
But maybe it would be interesting to look at that process. How is the first meeting with the mapping and what happens after that? So how? Yeah.
Perhaps what we're moving towards then is asking the question what actually constitutes quality in this in an implementation in a cross-adaptive setup. What is it that makes any given mapping of an instrumental sound and its processing good or effective? And I don't have any propositions to make. But
well, I think that's also very, of course, a very personal choice, because it might work for you, but then it might work well for your playing style, but it might be completely different for someone else. And yeah, I mean, this sort of mapping is sort of an expression field in itself. Making these mappings and making these decisions. These are aesthetic choices. But I think you do have to sort of look in detail at what is happening there. So and I mean that's a very difficult process to sort of set up the analysis, set up the mapping, set up the processing, and then sort of be able to still distinguish, like, okay, this wasn't working well. It didn't feel good. I felt sort of left out, and bringing that back to actually what you have to change in that whole setup. But still, you do have to do it and try out different things. And okay, does that change that feeling, or do I feel more in control? Do I feel more connected? And I think, just by at least trying to do that and trying different things out, and then sort of developing a vocabulary and way to discuss this with your fellow musicians. I think that's a very important part of the process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's of course at least 3 elements that you can change in that equation. Either what you put in, or how you analyze it, or what kind of changes that takes place on the processing side, and deciding where you should, if you're not happy with the result, where is the issue? Which element should I start? Which variable should I address first? And what are the consequences of that?
That's sort of these meta-instrumental skills that we have to develop to work in these systems. I think Christopher has a question. We haven't heard him yet. This.
just having one thought. My pitch get a little bit lower each time I ask a question. Get a little less nervous. But have all the sessions been with the mappings being static? Because it feels to me that, like, when you're talking about it, that the focus is for one performer to control parameters on the other performer, instead of a performer being able to tap into information from the other ones. So, like the whole panel we had here said that they were used to working with electronics together with their main instrument, and just using information from all the other band members to control those effects, but still be the one that controls what mapping goes to which effects, when that effect is on or off, how much the mapping affects and so on, could maybe be a way to kind of gain control over the instrument while still using a lot of the potential in the technology.
Absolutely. I think your first question, has all the sessions been with static mappings? And yes, they have. The reason for this is that we so far have felt we didn't know what was going on. So if we continually changed it while not knowing what was going on, it was hard to get some kind of traction. But I think both in terms of giving manual controls to how to tap into the resources or the data coming from the other one would be interesting, and also now that we know a little bit more, was sort of on step one. Maybe that could also be done on feature extraction too. So if you play faster, you will get another mapping.
Yeah, and also just having, I guess it's a little bit about the performer's interest in how they want to use the technology. It can be used in many different ways, as a lot of people have explained. But for myself, I think it would be so interesting to have an instrument and, okay, now I turn on these things and they're being affected by the other musicians, but now I want to do something else, so I turn off this and turn on this other thing, which can use information from the other ones on that. So you have more control to shape your sound, but still getting all this input to make so many interesting expressions.
Yeah. I totally like that scenario. Just one technical issue about it is that when you turn off the automatic control of some parameter, it is sort of left there, and it does no longer correspond with perhaps your manual settings of them. So there might be a lot of unintended parameter changes when you start to tweak buttons when you don't know where they are, or sudden jumps, or so there's problems. Yeah,
it's have a value scaling.
Yeah,
pickup modes.
It's just and yeah, but if you have pickup mode, you start to push this fader and nothing is happening, and you sort of think that you're doing something, and maybe you don't hear the sound clearly enough to sort of pick up that. I mean, we can think we're doing a lot sometimes when there's minor changes. So I'm just saying that we need to solve that somehow.
Yeah, I
would love to come with some inputs.
Yeah,
in the
great,
back room.
Great, yeah.
I think it's sort of like the moment you sort of start giving the musician then additional controls to do a kind of meta control. Okay, now these kinds of effects are on. Then it's sort of moving again a bit more towards sort of the situation of the augmented instrument, where the performer has these additional controls over the processing. And if you, I mean, the other way to do it would be to look at sort of doing analysis on more sort of phrase level, sort of a longer time scales, which can sort of put the system in different states. So I don't know if there's been like fast passages, maybe the machine then decides, okay, now we change the processing because it's been in here long enough. So I change the environment so the musicians can adapt to it again, and then it would go more to like sort of the live algorithm, which has a kind of sort of longer time scale control over what is happening, to change configurations and switch between sections maybe. So there's two directions you can go with this. But it might not keep the pure concept of the cross-adaptive processing. But I don't know how important that is.
It's probably not that important that it's pure. Now I see the clock is ticking, so we're our time for this session is up, and we're about to have a nice performance by Trond, Tone, and Karl Haakon. And just to end this, I mean, to kind of tie in some of your comments also, the reason why we make these tools as VST plugins is that people could use them in any way they want. There is no way we'll impose any policing on how you how you use it, and we're excited to see how that develops. So do you need 10 minutes to set up, or are you 10 minutes? Yeah, we'll take 10 minutes. And thank you, Marije.
Til det siste, det var jo litt sånn snakk om hvordan du kunne endre på opplegg, ikke sant, mens du holder på. Det hadde jo, det har dere kanskje tenkt da, men det går jo an å bruke presets for eksempel. Så det bare skifter mellom presets for eksempel. Og da, og si en da har øvd mye, så kan en øve inn 4-5 presets, så vet hvordan det funker. Og så live, og så er det bare å switche mellom presets da.
Ja, for det som altså de parametrene til mappinga, altså, de er jo også parametre i DOM, så de kan også justeres, automatiseres. Så det er ganske greit, men det som jeg synes kanskje er problematisk, det er hvis når man skrur av automasjonen, så har man en hel del knapper som man ikke helt vet hvor er.
Når han slår av automasjon.
Hvis man sånn som begynner å gå inn og ut av å la ting styres.
Ja.
Så når man da slipper noen ting som har vært automert, så har kanskje den verdien havnet oppi der også.
Ja, sånn.
Og så vet du ikke hvor den er.
Nei.
Så skal det hente den, og så må du enten få den til å komme hit, eller du må gå opp der og hente den. Men hvis du skal gå opp der og hente den, så må du vite at den er der.
Ja,
Og det vet
sant.
du ikke.
Men vet ikke programmet det, da?
Jo, men hvis du som utøver skal ta over den manuelt,
Ja.
hente den hjem, så må du... Det er den.
Det er det som er vanskelig.
Eller det er sånn konseptuelt bare litt vanskelig å skjønne hvordan det skal...
Ja, ja, sant.
Det er for at
Det er godt. Ja, men det er jo kjempe.
Yeah. Okay. We're ready to start the next session. Sound engineer running down the stairs to grab the mixer. Please welcome Haakon Waadeland, Tone Åse, Trond Engum. everyone's welcome to ask whatever you like to ask the musicians about what happened. If you're curious about anything, I guess someone is.
Haakon, why no cymbals?
Because I have so many metal things here, so I don't need any cymbals. And I like the texture of the drums. Just like, this recording by Peter Gabriel. He didn't want to have any cymbals on it many years ago.
Thank you.
Did you hear what we were doing?
Since we get to ask the questions. Why don't you tell us something about how you mapped the whole thing? What was going on?
It was quite a simple setup, quite simple analysis methods. I need to remember now. It's the volume of the voice controls pitch shift on the drums, and that's what we started with, and then additionally, that's why all these small cymbals comes to good use in that sort of situation, just blending between the original sound and the down-pitch sound. And then there was an echo introduced, which are controlled by the transient density of the drums, meaning the faster you play, the more transient, and less you play, less transients. And these are used to control the time span between 12 delays on Tone's voice. So that was the cross-adaptive sort of starting point for it. Then there was a part in the middle where you certainly heard that there was some feedback issues going on, which was not very clear in what it was, but it was the guitar, not a processed guitar, but the dry sound of the guitar controls or takes away an reverb effect on the drums. So the more guitar, the less reverb on the drums. So it's the more is less sort of mapping. And then in the end we introduced the same control that Tone has over the drums with the pitch. The more the pitch goes down on the drum kit, and at the same time she was invited into my guitar setup, so that we have the pitch that the louder you sung, the pitch goes up until 2 octaves in addition to the guitar. So the drums drops and the guitar goes up depending on how loud she sings. So that's basically it. And yeah, we just try to navigate in these 3 rooms we haven't tried to make transformation between them, and so that's about it.
Did you have any additional effects apart from those you described, Trond?
I had. You also played a little bit because, and this is regarding the discussion earlier today. Okay, I'll be quick. I see you have a question. So how do we use this? Do we use it simply as, do we get any farther than just concentrating on what we can do together with our acoustic inputs? And today I had decided to try to bring in some of my sounds. And this is also interesting because what can I do not to interfere with not to mess up what you're doing in a way. And but to me, it's a goal, because I usually, as Sigurd, I work with live electronics, and that's kind of my instrument. So of course, now the cross-adaptive also becomes my instrument, and that took some time to get used to. But I would really like to combine it sometimes with the rest of my instrument. But that's a longer way to go, I think. Yeah. There's a question here. Yeah.
But also a lot of drums. So I was wondering whether when you used the EBO, did the was there an effect on the guitar additionally to the EBO, or did the use of the EBO sort of manipulate the drum sound as well?
Just for the volume, so the sound of the EBO in itself didn't affect the drum on the sound, so it's just the volume. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I've used it's a volume pedal on the guitar, analog one, which in sort of a way I can use as an standard MIDI controller as well. Without playing anything, I could use it as a volume on of sort. I didn't do that now, but it's an option if I need to. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's really exciting for me to be part of this. I'm the only one who has not earlier been involved with live electronics. And well, before this cross-adaptive happened, I was processed by Trond and Øyvind and Bernt sometimes. But now I'm also happy to be able to process Tone and Trond by means of how I'm playing. So that's very exciting.
I was just curious if you had, did you have a plan for your performance? If so, did you follow that plan?
We had, the rough plan was to go through these 3 different mappings. And yesterday we spent most of the time trying to make it work, but a little bit of time just trying to find out what musical strategies could work. But we didn't decide. We decided that I should start, which we think is a very nice start. But it's I like the idea of starting with one of the acoustic instruments just alone. It's a nice way of kind of framing everything, and then you can go from there. But that was the only plan. But of course, as we talked about earlier today, also when you work, the longer you work, the more strategies you could come up with, and sometimes they are conscious, but sometimes you just go to places where you've been. You know, you find some rooms while you improvise, and then that's the place you can go to, or not. So.
Yeah, and I guess it's correct to say that we had kind of rehearsed these different scenes or different audio rooms, and we agreed on trying not to rush too much. I'm not quite sure if we managed to do that, but so we had kind of an idea of how to start, and also sort of how to finish. Yeah. So the first room and the last room were kind of planned ahead, at least as musical scenes.
Carl, I have a very silly remark, because I misheard you just recently. I thought you said you were possessed by Øyvind and Trond.
Oh yeah. Well,
and somehow I think that makes a lot of sense. This is all about cross-adaptive possessing. So maybe that's a new name for the project.
Yeah, I guess I'm both possessed and processed.
But I just want to make a remark, because you talked about how you've been in Oslo. You've been working really on this to find this. What is the your impulse? What's it called? Impulse response. Yeah. Your input. What's your instrumental element? And the more complex the pattern, the mapping is, the more focused you get on how you can do things with very kind of work with the small ideas over a longer stretch, just to make things clear in a way. If you see, yeah.
Yeah, I guess this is a question for all those doing performances as well as you. Have you tried using the cross-adaptive processing out in the wild yet, like doing a show at a club or a bar show? And if not, are you considering doing that within the project?
We did a performance at the conference in Porto, but it wasn't a club. But I don't know if that goes for a club. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it was nice.
I mean, is it at a stage where it's still considered risky in terms of it being software that might crash during the performance?
Yeah. Simon. Okay.
It never crashes during performance.
Yeah.
That's what rocket engineers always say right before it.
Maybe you've answered this during another question. I want to get a grip on one relationship thing on stage. There's 3 of you, that's 3 combinations of 2. Exactly which of you is going into which and who. Cross-adaptives so far today has mean 2. Now we've got 3. Is that 3 pairs? Or is it 1, 3? What are the inputs to the cross-adaption and who is which?
We got inputs from everyone.
Yes, but there are 3 of you.
Could you visualize first? It was
yes.
Yeah.
And then it was you 2.
Yes. Okay.
And then it was
us 3.
So it was 3 2s. Yeah. That's exactly what I wanted. So each scene you focused on a particular pair, cross-adapting.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
I just want, it's really loud. I really think it's super clear what you do, working with the texture, which is really nice as an audience, because when you just it's really like, you work with the texture of the effect as well, and also all of you do that, so it's really like, super nice compositional work, I think. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. We're just 5 minutes till the next session, just to overrig. So if you want to stretch your legs, 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you for your patience. We will now continue this afternoon seminar with technical sessions about, well, things we have developed, things we needed to develop during this project. I'll have Sigurd Saue with me and Victor Lazzarini. We'll be talking about instrument design and development, these convolution techniques that both Sigurd and Victor has been integral in making happen, and also some details about open zone control that we needed to refine in the implementation to make it efficient for us, and then briefly about some signal conditioning that we need to do on these quite standard MIR analysis things, these signals, to make them more manageable as controller data. Then I'll hand it over to Sigurd.
Thank you, Øyvind. All right, this is the fun part. I was considering doing some tap dancing while I was doing this presentation, but you will get some formulas, but not too many. Convolution, as Øyvind told you about before, is frequently used in for adding reverberation, for instance. So you have a convolution reverb. It is very common in a lot of filtering, FIR filter as they call it. That's sort of the technique. So it's a very old technique, and as the formula you can see here has this is not a multiplication, so this star sign in the middle there is a convolution operator. And the end is what it actually does. And I made this awesomely handsome, there's a interesting. This is the direct form, the time domain formulation of the convolution. And something that we can notice at once, there are no parameters except the filter length. But filter length is not something that you really work on in a live situation. It's sort of a fixed size. And then we will soon see that the length of the result will be the double of the length of the two signals. And also that the order of multiplications is n squared, which means that you have 1 second of sound, that's 40,000 samples. Then you need to have 40,000 squared operations to get the output, which means this is a very computational heavy operation. A good thing, though, is convolution is delay-free, and I'll show you why. This is the two signals we have. This is my immersive animation. What's happening in this formula is that you actually sort of flip one of the signals, the red one, and then you sort of slide it through each other. So they start overlapping, and as you can see, the first hit between those two signals is just involving one coefficient for each of them, which means that the result is produced just by one sample of each. And then they slide through, and when they completely overlap, then all samples of both signals are involved, and then they slide past it, or at the end there's just one sample of each, just when they're sort of leaving each other. So that's how convolution works. And one interesting property of convolution is that it actually has some kind of ramp function built in, as a sort of a smoothing. So if you convolve this signal with itself, this is just a sinusoid in a square rectangular window. If you convolve it with itself, it looks like this. It sort of fades in and fades out. Naturally, that's sort of inherent in convolution. And that's very important for us to know when we do smart stuff with convolution. Because, of course, we have done smart stuff in convolution. So, as I said before, the time domain, the time way of doing convolution is very computational heavy. So that's why we do fast convolution instead, using the frequency domain. And the thing is that if you a convolution in the time domain turns into pure multiplication in the frequency domain. So you simply just multiply the two signals together. And what does that really mean? That means that if you have overlapping frequencies in the two signals, they will multiply and they'll get very strong in the output. If you don't have overlapping frequencies, it will be very quiet. That's one challenge with convolution, because sometimes if you happen to have a lot of frequency overlap, the output signal is very strong. If you don't, it's very quiet. That's just mentioned that in passing. The good thing about this is that it's much cheaper because you have just multiplications. The bad thing is that you have to have the FFT of the entire signal and then do the multiplication, which means you have a lot of latency because you need the entire signal before producing a result. That's why we also come up with, or some other people come up with partition convolution, where you actually split up. I don't know if you can, if you haven't, no, I can try. Hope I don't. Oh, yeah, you can split up the impulse response. So this the top signal here is what we call the impulse response. You can split it in 3 in this case. And then there's separate frequency domain transformations on each part, and then do the multiplications on each part, and then splice them together. And that's sort of an optimal compromise between doing this in time domain, which is latency-free, or doing it completely in the frequency domain, which is introduces latency. So this is our starting point. We work with partition convolution, with small parts of, let's say, 1,000 samples or so. Because what we want to achieve, we want to update this filter dynamically. We don't want a fixed filter. We want a filter that we can change while playing. And that's coming out of the live processing project, or the cross-adaptive project. How can we make this happen? There are traditionally 2 ways of doing this. One is actually having an instantaneous switch, which means that you simply just replace one filter with the other, that this bang. What happens then is that you pretty sure will get clicks and pops and artifacts in the output signal because you get a discontinuity. You got this, so that's not really an option. We have done it by actually just fade down the signal, do the switch, and then fade up again, which is kind of cheating, I would say, but that's one option. The other option is having 2 convolution filters going and then just crossfade between them when you go from one to the other. That's okay, that works fine, except that you need those 2 processes, and you also need to manage the crossfade, which costs computational power. So that's the problem with these 2 approaches. So what we do stepwise, I don't know, I worked on that name, stepwise replacement of convolution filter. In short, SROF. Thank you. So what is this? Well, let's look at what LiveCom. This is the CSUN opcode LiveCom that I programmed early this year. Basically, what it does, it looks at this situation. You have a filter that at one point before TR, which is a sort of replacement time, you switch all the coefficients from one filter to the other. You go from the B coefficients to the A coefficients. If you look at the math of this, just in this transition from the point TR to the end of the filter, TR plus N minus 1. In this transition, you will see that there are 2 elements here. You have this part belonging to the second filter, and this part belonging to the first filter. And if you look carefully, I don't know if you're able to look carefully at math, but if you do, you will see that there's no overlapping between coefficients. So if at the exact first point, TR, you will see that the first part, this one, has just one element, which is for the TR, which means that's the only coefficient from the second filter that's introduced. While this part has all the rest. And sort of when you slide the time axis further on, this filter will fill up, and the second filter will sort of just slide out. And this is just how convolution works. So, and this is also what we want to exploit in our project. So simply what we do this, we just use one buffer for the filter, not 2, not having crossfade, nothing. We just introduce the coefficients of the new filter one by one from the beginning, just in time for their use in the convolution operation. So the convolution is running all the time. We just introduce the new coefficients from the beginning, and there's actually no artifacts, and it sounds exactly like switching between 2 convolution filters. And what we achieve in this case is that we let the old filter complete its tail, which means that you saw the sort of fade out of the old filter. That is now completed with this way of doing things, instead of doing a hard switch where the tail is actually just cut off. And at the same time, we also get the fade in of the new filter by doing a gradual or a stepwise replacement. So this is sort of the core of everything, and extremely easy yeah, maybe someone has done it before, but if not, there's this brilliant mind found it. And just to cover another case, if we have multiple replacements, so in this case 3 different filters, changing one at the time R1 and the second at time R2. If those times are long enough apart so that there's actually a complete filter length between them, then there's just simply two replacements, one going from A to B, and then later on one going from B to C. That's just what we've seen before. But what if those 2 times are positioned less than a filter length apart? Then we actually have 3 filters contributing to the output result. And the interesting thing is the middle filter, because as you can see, its contribution it still works. There's still no overlap between coefficients. So you actually have 3 filters contributing to the output at the same time, except that the middle filter is not using the entire input. So in this case, it will just be limited to the number of inputs in that represented by the difference between those 2 times. So let's say if you have 5 time steps between R1 and R2, then there will just be 5 input samples actually going through that filter at each time. So what this means, it still works, but the input is sort of segmented. So every part of the input that's before R1 is just going through the first filter. We'd never touch the other ones. Every part of the filter going in after R2 is just going through the last filter, is never touching the other ones, while the part of the input that's between R1 and R2 is just going through the middle filter, not touching the other ones. So that's what's really happening under the hood, that you actually segment the input into the different filters. So I'm just going to show you some figures of an example. And this is a contrived example that Øyvind made for me. It makes a lot of sense. You have 2 impulse responses, top left and top right. They're both sinusoids with this sort of this envelope shape. One with, I think, is 10 hertz and the other 60 hertz, if I don't remember wrong. So those are the input responses up the top. At the bottom, you'll see the source signal, x of t or whatever, which is just a train of impulses, 3 impulses per second. So what will it look like if we convolve this signal? Okay. So first of all, let's say that we put on a transition point at 1 second. I try to mark it so that the first impulse response is only valid for the first second, and the second impulse response is only valid for the rest of the signal. This is what it looks like if you just convolve the first second of the input with the first impulse response. Is that understandable? The yellow line marks the 1 second where the transition actually happened. And as you can see, you get this fade out after that point of time. But it's still there. It's still sort of ringing out the filter. What happens then if you convolve the second filter with the part of the input from 1 second and beyond? It would look like this. So this is the second impulse response, and it's just starting at 1 second, and then you can see you have this gradual fade in, and then it just continues normally. What happens if we add these 2 together? It will look like this. You can see there's a transition region which stretches from 1 second to 2.5 seconds. I don't know if you can see the numbers, they're quite small, but 1 second is a yellow line. And then, so this is the sum of the 2 on the top, but this is also the result if you do the switching of the stepwise replacement of the impulse response. The exact same figure. So actually having just 1 convolution buffer being replaced gradually while running convolution gives the exact same result as doing 2 separate convolutions broken in time like this. And just to make it very, very clear, this is actually what the impulse response buffer looks at different times. The very nice colors. Yes. Graphic design by me. And MATLAB. So the blue figure is impulse response 1. The violet figure at the end is impulse response 2, and that's so the first one is at the beginning of the transition, and the last one is when the transition is over. And then you can see in the middle what the buffer looks like. It's actually part of it is the new filter, and the most of it is the old filter. That's 1/3 the new, 2/3 the old. And next step, 2/3 the new, 1/3 the old. And so actually, this is what it looks like inside the buffer. And the strange thing is that there seems to be discontinuities in these figures, in those transition regions. But it doesn't really matter, for each of those are multiplied, producing one single output. So they are not really temporal objects. They are just something that adds to a multiplication for one single output sample. So those discontinuities, you can see here, they don't really affect the result at all. And I think I'm pretty close. Ah, yeah, the advantages of LiveCon. Too numerous to tell. But I'll try to try it anyway. Okay. So first of all, we avoid the discontinuities and artifacts of having an instantaneous switch, while at the same time having sort of the same cost of doing this. There's no extra cost. The second thing, we don't need those explicit crossfadings of two parallel convolution processes. It's just one process, and the crossfading is sort of built in by convolution itself. Those things are great. That's by itself. But for live performances, what's even more interesting is that we can have the minimum possible delay, which means you can actually start convolving with a filter that you haven't recorded yet. As long as the first sample of that filter, or in this case, the first partition of this filter, is available, we can start working with it. Because the remaining partitions will be filled in during convolution with that new filter. That means that this is not just sort of a post-fact, it's something you can do really on the spot or in real time. You can convolve with a filter that's actually being built while convolving. So that's what makes this, I would say, is probably the most interesting contribution to this particular project. I think that's all about LiveConv. It is. Okay, thank you.
So just to illustrate Sigurd's nice description for us here, I will show you the VST plugin that I built around this LiveConv opcode in CZone. And I mean, you have heard it a little bit today, but now we'll demonstrate it in a very pedagogical fashion to illustrate the points made by Sigurd. I'll get back to this tapsophone instrument. And now, hopefully, when I push this pedal, you can see the impulse response here being recorded. And then let's see. What signals do we have here? That's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? To do. Okay. Should work. 2, 2. 2, 2, 2. Oh, it was the wrong convolver. I have too many. Let's see. Here we have something. Ta-da-da-da. Oh. Oh, oh, oh.
We sell them cheap.
Yeah, we sell them cheap. Yeah, we do. One, 2, 3, 4. My, oh my. That's number 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 2. Right. So what I intended to do was this. Right. Okay. So it's an impulse response. So if I put an impulse into it, I actually play back.
So what I intended to do with this,
the recording, but if what Sigurd showed was that, let's say we have a filter like this, and we want to replace it. Now I can continue using this filter and enter something else, and this rhythmical pattern will continue to flow with all the sound that has entered the filter. So, like that. And you can see the graphics represent whatever part of the impulse response currently being recorded. Perhaps one important fact that Sigurd did not mention is that you can see the whole impulse response here, and even if I only want a short impulse response, we continue recording all the way to the end, so that we always have the full length of the filter, which also is a condition for making this artifact free. Well, that's it. I'll hand it over to Victor to talk about streaming convolution, that I like to call it, but you call it time variant.
So, can you hear me? Good, great. Okay, so what happened was that I was driving, as I always do, to take my kids to their music class on Saturday, and it's a 1 hour drive, and I have to be thinking of the next thing that I'm going to be doing. And I was happened to be thinking of what they have been doing, because I heard the samples of the, some videos that even did with the live conv, and I was trying to figure in my head, what they were doing, because I hadn't read the code. I was very lazy, and I could have gone and read the code, because they've given me the code to look at, but I hadn't. So I thought, oh, let's try to figure it out. Let's think about this. So so basically, let's try to emulate what they're doing, but without really thinking too much about it, starting sort of from a kind of afresh. So this is Sigurd's equation in a kind of a graphical form. What you have is the signal coming to the top there, and you can see it's the t is the time, so t minus 1 is 1 sample behind, 2 samples behind, 3 samples behind. So it's going into delay line up until the kind of sample is delayed by the length of the filter there. And then each one of those inputs are going to be multiplied by a sample of the impulse response, going up forward there, until you get to the end. And you then, for every sample, you do these multiplications, and then you add everything together. So it's the n multiplications plus the additions that Sigurd was talking about. So that's what convolution is. So this is my thinking. Okay, I'm thinking. Okay, that's what it is. That's so there you have an input signal. I have an impulse response. I have an output signal. This an impulse doesn't change, so it's a time invariant. So it's a linear time invariant system. Also finite impulse response filter. That's fine. So I'm thinking here, well, what if then we would do something like this, which is reinterpret the operation as one is one input signal, and the other one is another input signal. So instead of having an impulse response, you have another input signal that's just another input signal, and then you have the output. And so because these two signals are varying in time, you allow them to vary their arbitrary signals. we obtain a linear time varying system, or a TVFR, with, and because the signals are going, that's why it's a streaming thing. They're just going into the future. And okay, so well, that seems feasible. So what we need to do here, well, we need to just reinterpret it like that. So you have x1 coming in the top, they're delayed, and x2 coming here, and basically those are the samples of the signal coming into the future. So that's the reinterpretation we're doing. We haven't changed much of it. And think, well, thinking, well, we can, well, if that works, that's what they're doing. So that's me thinking, without reading their code. So, oh, let's do a proof of concept. So I sat down and kind of wrote this little instrument here. That's basically what to do with that. You have a table writer, which is the table W there, and that's controlled by a phaser so that you go and write to beginning to the end. Every sample goes to beginning to the end. So that's the one signal going in. That goes into a functional table, and that is read by a direct convolution of code that exists in C-Sound that reads the functional table and applies a convolution to an input signal. So that's effectively the previous picture. And then, okay, does it work? So for that, then I put two signals and got this. So this is the drum beat, and someone speaking to Quick Brown Fox jumps over the lazy dog. So that's the two things going together. I say, wow, it works. So, okay, so that's then, this is direct convolution. So the basic TV conv is what it is. It's two input signals, two delay lines, time varying FIR, basically, FIR, and not, it's then in my head, that's the same thing that they did, which is exactly the same thing that they did, but in a different form, actually. But because we're talking about making it efficient, so we did basically a fast convolution there. So we just do the time slicing there that the partitions that we're talking about, that Sigurd was talking about, and we partition it and then multiply them together, and you get the output. So that's fast convolution. And then I thought, oh, how can I break it? Because, I'm very fond of the Trevor Richard school of signal processing, that you shouldn't really be listening to engineers. You should be just doing what you feel that it could do, and it could break, and if it breaks, it's better. So I started freezing the input. So the input comes in, and you just press a button, it just freezes, and it keeps. So that, in a way, it's not replacing the impulse response, but it's in a much more abrupt way. So you just stop replacing, and then you have a mixture of old samples and new samples, and that is the new impulse response. It keeps going. Of course, if you freeze it for a long time, then it's frozen filter, and that becomes time invariant. You just have one. Then you have the standard convolution. So you could, in a way, emulate what they're doing there by freezing, reading the impulse response, freezing, and then holding that, and then unfreezing, and then that when you unfreeze, then the new samples are replacing one by one and smoothly in a way that they're doing. So in the way that's the Sigurd's doing. So that's basically what it does. So this is the TV conv, and that's the code. Take two freezing switches, takes the size of the filter, which is n, and takes the size of partition, which is n. The partition can be 1, so you can run this on a direct convolution basis with no delay to start from 0. So partition can be 1. If it's not 1, then it's going to be doing the FFT. And then two input signals, which can be, then we don't have the distinction between this is impulse and this is the the impulse response, and this is the original signal. The two are just two arbitrary signals. Now, it's kind of, when we come down to analyze it, what it's actually doing, it's a little bit more complicated. And I don't think, you didn't get me my other slides with the plots. It doesn't really matter. I'm just saying that in a few, one thing that you have to be aware here is that there's a filter, a certain filter length. And then, so if you think about it, the filter length is kind of a boundary in a way that the impulses that are before the boundary, they are respective to the filter that's here, and then the impulses that are after the boundary, they are respective to this boundary start. So any delays are in relation to that. So there is some things that, and there was some plots that I kind of contrived to show how a sine wave behaves with depending on where the impulses are coming. If the impulses are longer than the filter, the separation in one signal, then there will be some gaps because there will be some slides. And if the impulses are smaller than the filter, so a train of impulses, then there will be some squeezing, something. But that was kind of a contrived signal just to show some effects. So I have some examples here just to play. So when I did this, then I sent it to Øyvind, and also I used it as part of the live electronic setup for piano and electronics piece. And I think we have it here to play a little bit, give you an example. So that gives you kind of some flavor of the process. This is, of course, there's only one player there, so it's autos, or there's self-convolution involved. So there's two signals that come from the piano, but there's a delay and a processing. There's a filtering one of the signals, so so they come together. And also there's some freezing in at some points, and so that's why you get these different things happening. Those are the plots I was talking about. Just to give you an example. So if you have, so those are the two signals coming into the filter, and there at the top, so I have a sine wave and I have a impulse train. Now at the top I have the impulse train happening once per filter size, filter length. So it's just happening at the first sample, the filter length, and then when you have the output is basically the convolution is the input signal, because it's just basically starting. If you think about the impulse as a starting, playing back the signal from there, that's what it's doing. So the next one, I make the impulses a little bit longer than the filter length, and as you can see, you're going to have what's going to happen is that in the convolution, you see that the first block there is the waveform up into the end of the filter, and then because there's no impulse there, what will happen is that the waveform is delayed by a certain amount of samples and starts where the impulse is and carries on and so on. So you have all these bits there. But that's kind of the normal thing that will happen anyway, because of the impulses being so spaced apart. And you can see that the relative point to that start of the wave here it's where it's finished there. So it's just pushed there. That same thing here is pushed there. So the two signals are going like that. And then the final one is just pushing the impulses close together, and then you can see that the wave starting at the end there being another copy of the wave starting there and just starting from the beginning and then finishing off and carrying on and so on. But this, as I said, these plots are just for us to figure out what's actually going on there. When we have complex signals going on, this situation is hardly going to happen. But if it happens, well, it's how it is. Okay, thank you.
Then hopefully with a minimum of fuss, I will demonstrate how this works in practice. So what you hear now is the continuing and extreme convolution of my voice, with what I'm doing here. And if I'm only playing on one of the instruments, like with the voice now, or there's no sound. So there has to be sound on both channels for there to be any output sound. And then when there's sound, they are convolved with each other. And then we can do as what Victor explained about the discontinuities, they don't occur in practice here. Because discontinuities in the filter moves along the filter at the same rate as the incoming sound, so they don't change. But if we freeze the filter, we would hear these discontinuities. And we have two trigger buttons here to freeze different parts. Now we have a froze specifically from this one. So if I'm doing ta 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 Tap, 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 tap. So in this manner, we can live convert two signals without actually sampling, but we can freeze. So it's related to the live con, but almost opposite. Okay, that's it for the convolution part. Maybe if anyone has any questions about this. Yeah.
And then is it on? Hello. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Actually, my first question is going back to the live convolver, because you showed first like the regular convolution in the time domain, and then the partitioned convolution. But then in the description of how you update the response step by step, you didn't show how that works for the partitioned version then again. So I'm wondering, is this updating then happening per block of the partitioned convolution?
Yeah, it is. So the only reason I use time domain to show it is it's easier to actually show in a formula. So
yeah,
basically it's all partitioned. So the unit of replacement is the partition, not a single sample anymore.
Yeah.
But it still works the same. Except, of course, the replacement time had to be exactly on a partition border, or it will be on a partition border.
Yeah, so you're quantizing there a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess it's kind of tied to the other thing, because it seems the typical length of the impulse responses in both cases is quite long actually. So it's almost like live sampling and overdubbing. Or yeah, depending on the input. I mean, if you have a very percussive sort of impulsive, which is almost like an impulse train, it becomes like triggering live samples.
Yes. So, but an instrument that is as percussive as this is perhaps the exception. So more this kind of playing would trigger the convolution in a very different way, obviously.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've experimented with also the length of these impulse responses, because I think if you make them much shorter, it gets much more textural than if you have these very long ones.
Yeah. So like with the way we use the live convolver, we can change the effective length of the impulse response by how long we record. So even though the full impulse response is now somewhere along 6 seconds, it's the effective impulse response is really short. For TVConf, we haven't figured out how to make it variable length.
No, it's fixed for each filter, each operator is fixed.
Yes, but there are some things that I wanted to ask you about in how we maybe could get around that. Because if we did enveloping like this, so we keep the full filter length, but we envelope the input and then reset the right pointer at will, then we could have arbitrary. Yeah.
There's been some graphical issues on the newest OSX version of some plugins for the live convolver and the analyzer. Have they been fixed yet?
One more time.
The graphical problems that we've been having on the newest OSX version for the live convolver.
and the analyzer, has it been fixed yet?
There are some issues with the cabbage graphics that I haven't had time to look into, and it's also in part due to Rory Walsh's implementation. So they're not fully fixed. They were halfway there.
It's really not a question, but just a comment if there are any first graders here. I don't know, of course, I think you mentioned that this is sea sound and cabbage. And you in first grade, you will actually do your first baby steps this spring of and so you could actually use TVCon and LiveCon half a year or so. A little more.
Yeah, yeah. Some things that we would like to do to take this further are related to extensions to convolution that you, Miller, have worked with together with Chris Donahue and Tom Erb, and the whitening process of manipulating the impulse response seems to me like it should be possible to do in this live setting. But you also had some comments earlier on that it would be hard. Do you think still think it would be hard?
There's maybe a more general question, which is what that work was. One way of thinking about that work is that it's a sort of a form of dynamics processing, where, say, instead of multiplying the two amplitudes at a given frequency so that the result might be very large or very small, you could consider taking the geometric mean of them so that the resulting amplitude is always between the two amplitudes it goes in, so that it's actually controllable. That's one possible example. But it seems to me there's a more general question, which is, have you already done something about dynamics processing to deal with the problem of the thing getting very loud when the two inputs have the same pitch and very quiet when they're, say, a tritone apart?
Actually, no. We just compress the hell out of it.
Oh, well, that's dynamics processing. that works. But you're compressing at the output.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
So perhaps it's interesting to compress it channel by channel as you're multiplying the FFTs together, so that you get so that you don't have to adjust the entire amplitude, but you get the idea.
Yeah, but I think I would like to look into how to do that bin by bin, or in the spectral domain, to process to look for spectral overlaps, and then maybe compress those selectively.
Right. And so there's a lot of messing around to do there. That
Yeah.
would be some fun for later. Yeah.
Okay, I think yes.
Again,
to do.
Again, can you hear me? Okay. Again, taking the Trevor Richard school, a leaf out of his school of DSP, forget to do convolution the right way, and then just start sort of multiplying phase vocoder signals, which we do with some of the things there, but then do some dynamics processing in there as well. We will just forget about tails, forget about this thing, but that the kind of cross synthesis aspect of it will be maintained somehow.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something we can do there as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fun to be had with this still. Okay, if we're done with convolution, we'll go on to the next part. And there's like a brief intermezzo here, just mentioning various contributions to C-Sound opcodes that we've been doing both with Sigurd and with LiveConf, and actually all the rest of these have been implemented by Victor as utilities that we needed to overcome technical obstacles. Some of them relating to analysis of signals, but more importantly, the open sound control, sending and receiving NC sound. You want to talk about this, Victor? Yeah, so we have some there was here is your slides for the OpenC stuff. Yeah.
So very briefly, just talk a little bit about what we had to do with open sound control. So there were basically two things that we needed to do. So open sound control, for those of you who haven't worked with it, is a protocol for sending control messages over the IP network, usually through UDP. And there are two issues that we've had identified with the current implementation OSC that we were using. There was some latency, unexplicable latency in sending OSC messages. Sometimes they wouldn't just take longer than he required to get the message there. And then the other one was that for his setup, in order to sort of have an auto setup of things, he would like to go and parse, just get every single OSC message and parse its contents to see, what the senders were sending instead of selecting specific ones. So let's talk a little bit about each issue and what was involved. So the implementation of OSC in C-Sound uses liblow, which is an external library that does all the open sound control. It works well for incoming connections, which is generally the more complex part of to implement, which is you need to have a UDP server that will take in the message and will parse it and then give you the message that you want and the data you want. But in sending, unexpectedly, it was just taking, you ask liblow to send a message and you take ages. There's something there which we don't know what the problem is. Sending OSC messages is pretty simple. Just a matter of packaging the data in the UDP message. And so it was simple enough just to forget about liblow and just implement the sending of messages using UDP, using the system socket library, which every operating system has. And so lightweight and fast. Just to give you some background on OSC. So OSC, it's pretty simple in terms of structure. It's based on 4-byte blocks of data, so it will send always a multiple 4 bytes. And it starts with an address, which is a no-terminated string that normally has slashes to separate tokens, names of things. So for instance, the message, the kind of address full bar, would be placed there, and that, if you can see, that has 9 characters, or it has 9 bytes, and because of the 4-byte structure, you need to add some zeros just to pad it to 12 bytes, 12 bits, or not 12, 12 bytes. Sorry. Otherwise, you send it, and your OSC receiver won't understand it. So after that, after the address, you have then the data types, which can be I for integer, F for floating point, S for string, or B, which is for blob. Those are the basic types. So the types are encoded as a string again, with the letters for each type, for you expect of the data that's carrying. And in 4-byte blocks, so for instance, if you send just a floating point number, you have the comma, and then F, and then 2 zeros following. And so if the full message would be linked like that, in this would be the full message. You have the kind of 12 bytes of the address, followed by 4 bytes of the type, and then followed by the data, which is again 4 bytes, a floating point number. So string types will also denote a no terminated string, so it's a series of characters with a 0 at the end, and again needs to be a multiple 4 bytes. And a blob, it's basically a nondescript sequence of bytes which you interpret at the other end in any way you like. So the structure of that is requiring a length. You have the number of bytes in blob, and followed by the byte sequence. In C sound we have blobs, for instance, requiring arrays and audio signals and function table data. So that was easy enough to solve, and we solved that, and it seemed to be working fine. The second one is the idea of parsing OSC data. And we have, so the OSC receivers, the way they are designed is that they will respond to specific combinations of message address data types. So if you send a message and it doesn't match an address and a type, you just ignore it. That's the way, so for instance, how liblow would work. And that does everything for you. So CSOund only receives the data that it sort of parses, and it matches a requested address. Now, in this project, there's a requirement that you look at all the data and then parse it yourself to see the ones that are interesting to you. You know, there are no fixed set of data of data or addresses and so on that you need to respond to. So you like to be able to receive everything and then select the ones you like. So we have to find a means of listening to all incoming messages so that we can parse the contents. So we couldn't use liblow because of the liblow does the matching, the picking, the matching messages. We implemented then a UDP server that will listen to a given port, interpret any incoming message as per the OSC protocol, split in separate pieces, and give it to array. So this is what we did. It's the OSC raw, which listens to any incoming message, parses the message, outputs an array of strings with the components separately. The array of strings should have been already allocated, so it has to have a certain the space for all the message you want, and enough space for all the things that you want for the address, the types, and the data items. And then the KLAN is the number of items that were placed, so that you can then read the array and just read KLAN items from there. So that's what we've done, and this seems to work, and I think it does the job. Okay.
Then I'll show you why we needed to do this. So we have the open sound control signal flow of a bunch of analysis signals from the analyzer, and the efficient sending was needed to enable us to send as much as we want, as fast as we want between these two modules. And then the mapping module here will communicate with the DAW, and this should be, as I promised in my introductory slide this morning, we should be able to route this to any control in a DAW, and more or less any DAW is the ambition, but we started with Reaper and Live. So to enable that, we need some way of figuring out what the DAW expects us to send, because we don't want to code that manually for every control for every DAW. So we needed an open sound control learn method. Now, each of these DAWs have a different address structure for their open sound control messages. So that is why we needed to receive the raw data and see what is there. And then we could, by looking at what the DAW sends us, we can parse and figure out a way to learn what the DAW expects. So to enable a DAW to be controlled by open sound control, one way of doing that, or the way that we use, is to pretend that our open sound control mapping module is a control surface, like a hardware mixer in a studio. So we set up in Reaper, we set for control surfaces, we make a control surface setting, which is open sound control, and we set network ports, and then basically it works. For our purposes, we needed to expand the default setting a little bit because it had 8 tracks and 4 effects per track. And this is the only modifications we needed to do to the configuration settings. This part that I show here is a huge file with a lot of settings, but these are the only ones that needed changing. For Ableton Live, it's even simpler. You download a control surface called Live OSC. Use that in the preferences as a manner of controlling live, and then it's open sound controlled enabled. Then in our modulator, we hit learn, and we wiggle some parameter in the DAW. And when you wiggle a parameter in the DAW, it will send its address out. I'll try to show you this now. So I have a control channel here that responds to the transient density of my percussive board here. And if I hit learn and then wiggle this control and unlearn, it did not. Like this. Let's try. That's exciting. Well, apparently, for some reason, I was going to say this is something that can make your program crash, but it doesn't even crash. It just doesn't do anything. So let me just try to redo this. It's the demonstration effect, isn't it? There we go. Learn. And that's track 25 volume. Like that. So one thing I wanted to show you, let's just mute this, is that if I enable a lot of channels here, and this is a question to all of you, because this seems to run really smoothly, except if I send a lot of signals, it starts to get choppy. You see this? It was smooth before, but now it's not smooth. If I use a higher sending rate, it's even more choppy. This is not nice. But if I let's say we send just 10 messages a second, then it comes back to reasonably smooth. And now we are sending 8 open sound control messages continually. So what I'm asking is that our open sound control communication between the analyzer and the modulator is always smooth. You see this value here? It works smoothly, but the communication into the DAW is choppy, and this is the same for live and for Reaper. So for some reason, it seems like the DAWs have some limited bandwidth for automation, which is also really strange. Sorry?
If you create an OSC monitor. Hello? No? No, it's working. If you create an OSC monitor, forget the DAW and then replace the DAW with the monitor.
Yeah.
Then there will be a way of measuring whether the problem is at the DAW end or not. Wouldn't it?
Well, we do the exact same transmission between the analyzer and the modulator.
Ah, right, okay.
And with a lot more data.
So it works fine between the analyzer and the modulator, but it doesn't work between the analyzer and the DAW, is it?
Between the modulator and the DAW.
Interesting. Yeah.
So another master's project for someone? Okay.
And because the DAW is not open source, we have no clue of what the problem is.
Sorry?
Because the DAW is not open source, we can't even go and try to find out what the problem might be.
We really need an open source DAW. There was an open source version of Reaper back in 2011, but I think it's very much as is and use on your own responsibility, so perhaps not so useful. Okay, just a short insight into the a monitoring tool that we made, actually inspired by Miller, a way of plotting these different analysis signals instead of doing, as Björnar complained, trying to read these names while you're seeing how the splitters move. We can also plot over time how the signals behave, and you can see, I mean, these different types of signals that have been plotted that behave quite differently, and this is a way also to learn about how they act over time. So, for example, here we have a pitched. One of the axes is pitched, so like that. So it's also, I mean, as part of the learning how to play this instrument or how to understand these things. That's an extra tool. Then the last thing I wanted to tell you about was signal conditioning, because a lot of these analysis methods that we use, they are from music information retrieval, where for a large part, it doesn't matter so much if the signals contains elements that are not perceptually relevant, if they work and in the large part. But when we want to use these signals to control parameters, we want to eliminate those outliers. So, for example, for a sound like this, I hope this is not extremely loud.
Tuh.
Oh, it wasn't loud at all. Could you hear it?
Tuh. Tuh.
That sound. The spectral centroid looks like this. And the centroid, for those who are unfamiliar with it, tells something about where in the spectrum the main mass is. So if it's a very bassy sound, the spectrum will look like this. If it's a very high-end sound, high frequency sound, it will look like this. But what is particularly unpractical about this is that when the signal goes silent, we essentially have white noise, even though we don't hear it. So there's a lot of noise going on here, and that will give us an extremely high centroid. To alleviate this, we've used a noise floor threshold. So in the red areas here, you can see the amplitude envelope. Then we do not register any changes of the centroid. And in a few decibels above the noise floor, we don't allow dramatic changes to the centroid. We just allow it to influence the end result a little bit. And all of the signals that we use have similar techniques for conditioning, but I wanted to show you one of them just as an example. Well, we've talked about some tools and techniques that we have added and developed during this project as basis for the artistic work. Are there any questions to this now? Are you completely worn out after a long day? Yeah.
I have a mic already. This is a very fundamental question. I think the analysis is all done in C-Sound, and also the plugin that is part of the DAW is in C-Sound as well. So are you actually running two copies of C-Sound that are connected by OSC?
Yes.
Okay.
So each, to be able to analyze signals on different tracks, we use one analyzer plugin per track, and that'll be a separate C-Sound instance. And each of these communicate with a global modulator module that can receive from all of these analyzers.
Oh, I see. So in fact, each of these instances of C-Sound is a plugin in the same DAW, so they're in the same process, but they're still sending OSC messages among themselves within the process, which is the DAW. Correct?
Yeah. And maybe Victor will be able to explain more about why it needs, why we could not internally send between these C-Sound instances.
Oh, I think I can imagine why not, yeah. But that's a very interesting way of solving the problem.
You mean like impractical way?
No, interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Okay. Yes.
Well, the model that Cabbage has chosen to develop plugins that they will encapsulate. Each plugin encapsulates one instance of C-Sound, and you can put as many instruments as you like, as many things you like. But if you want to have a separate one, then it's a separate process and so on. It's a separate plugin within the same process, so it's a separate thread and so on. Now one of the problems is that there is no API inside the DAW to communicate between plugins. So we can't pass data from one plugin to another. If there was such a inter-thread or communication API, then we would, I guess, Rory could implement that, and that would be the way to pass messages between one and the other, but there isn't. So if you, in any case, if you had like a multitude of plugins and trying to communicate between one and they would have to use some sort of external message passing system such as OSC. That's how it is.
Yeah.
Because I don't think currently there is a way of a plugin to communicate to another arbitrary plugin within the DAW, apart from passing signals. You can pass signals, but you can't pass control data in that the same way. Or in a kind of an arbitrary way is kind of more signals within the, so you can't say send automation from one to another.
No. And of course, it would be we would not have all these problems if we implemented the whole analyzer, modulator, effects processing paradigm within CSound or Pure Data or Max in one single instance. But we have opted for the gain of relying on off-the-shelf software because we also wanted to incorporate it in standard workflows and allow others to use it. So that creates these additional problems. But there's also the practical side of having signal display and all these practical features that DAWs have.
Did you also try to to send out on separate channels? Does that have anything? If the DAWs has like a speed limit for how many messages it takes, does it help to separate it out on different channels? Have you tried this?
What kind of channels are you thinking of?
OSC channels? I don't know that much about OSC, but like the address you set?
Yeah.
The number after the internal
right.
IP address or something?
So actually what happens here...
Port, is that the name I'm looking after?
Is that this is the address of one message. And this is the address of another message.
Yeah, but...
so they have, I mean, in terms of, they have different channels, or everything is just one long chunk, and it's, the address is what identifies each message. Yeah, there's one port.
Yeah, that's what I meant, the ports.
Right. No, because we haven't tried it because the DAW will only accept a connection on one port.
But if you would use Max for Live, for example, that accepts several ports.
Yeah, you could...
One port per, for example.
You could probably do, I mean, as long as you have all the freedom that Max gives you, then you could do other control schemes. And that's one of the good things about Live. There's a lot of things that I mean, the added feature of Max for Live helps a lot. But then again, some would say that other limitations of Live makes it at least necessary to have another option.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that you've made this very general. So at this point now, all those 8 modules, which are mapping modules, are within a single plugin.
Yeah.
I believe, a single instance of the plugin. And it makes it seem like there must be a limited bandwidth by which a single plugin is allowed to change parameters in the DAW that it contains. In other words, the reason that the updates are slowing down when you, becoming choppy, as you say, when you are controlling a bunch of different parameters, probably is that the DAW that hosts the plugin will only accept a certain number of messages per second, which looks like it's around 80, right?
Yeah.
So perhaps it would be a good thing to do to have 8 separate instances of a plugin, each of which can only control one parameter, instead of one plugin that tries to control all the 8 as you're doing now. Except I appreciate there might be other horrible practical difficulties that would give you.
There was the problem of having several modulator plugins like this has to do with network ports, because once one of them listens to a port, when I want to learn, I need to assign a network port to the modulator to listen to whatever is coming from the DAW. And once one of them has acquired that port, no one else can get that port. So only one modulator plugin can learn at the same time.
They would all have to have separate ports then.
Yeah, but
then
I would have to...
right.
Or you would need to free the ports once it's learned.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, no, horrible. Okay, let's go back and think about this some more.
Yeah.
I guess on the other hand, you don't want to assign 2 OSC messages to the same parameter at the same time with the learn function. So it is an exclusive thing. You only want to learn the mapping one at a time.
Yeah.
So it is actually an exclusive operation. So
it is. So you could in
just
theory,
open
yeah.
up that port to listen when you click the learn button and close it again when you're done learning.
Yeah, I think we could do that. We'll have to look at it again, but it's a good that's a good plan. Thanks. Yeah.
In the analyzer plugin, I was looking at the code, and it seems like you're sending out information on several ports at the same time. Is there a specific reason for that?
Yeah, that has to do with if you wanted to have several modulators, which you can if you don't use Open Zone Control Learn, but you only want to send Open Zone Control anything, or for the MIDI version of the modulator, then you can have several of them. And because for the same reason, when one of them has grabbed the network port, no one else can have it, and thus we send on several network ports to allow several readers to clamp each separate port connection. Okay, I think we're running out of energy, are we? So thank you very much for your contributions today. Good hand for you. We'll have a sound check for those who are playing tomorrow, and at 8:30 there'll be dinner for the researchers and assistants then what to come. Okay, thank you. Simon, help me remember. Dinner is 7:30. 7:30. We can meet at the restaurant, and I'll also sweep by the hotel for those who are in the lobby 5 minutes before. Yeah.